And I'll encapsulate this, for you with one story. I was talking to a former Solicitor General right before I started on November 1st in 2018. And I even talked to them in connection with my nomination. And that person said, surely everyone will be very happy with your return. You are a Bush retread. They could do a lot worse.
Yeah.
And so, that I'd give you in response to your question about how does a nice guy like me suddenly become, some sort of demonic target, who's been, painted and frozen in Alinskyite terms. And the answer is that's what the left does when you do something that they don't like.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and I'm joined by
Nick Solheim, the COO of American Moment. Why did you hesitate?
I don't know.
That was weird.
I looked over and I realized your mustache is looking marginally less awful than in previous weeks.
Yeah, my wife trimmed it yesterday.
Yeah, I know. I was on the phone with her earlier today, and she mentioned it, and I was like, "That's great. You should just trim it all the way."
No, it's coming in. We're getting there.
If you'd like to make profound levels of fun of Nick, you should tune in on YouTube so that you can see how dumb he looks and then yell at him on the internet. I think that'd be really, really quite special. We have a fantastic episode for you guys today. As always, before I tell you about who we have on, please go to AmericanMoment.org. There you can find everything that we have cooking here at American Moment, whether it's events, panels, AmCanon, AmericanMoment.org/join, which you can fill out to meet with us and figure out how to get involved beyond just listening to podcasts, sitting in your underwear on your couch all day, and much, much more. This week, we had a fantastic guest on for a conversation that I will freely admit I monopolized and barely let Nick talk, but I had a ton of fun. We had on Jeff Clark, who's the former President Trump selected and Senate confirmed Assistant Attorney General of the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the U.S. Justice Department, and also, twofer here, the former Acting Assistant Attorney General for the DOJ's Civil Division, overseeing over 1,400 lawyers between the two. He is a very, very smart man. He carried out President Trump's agenda at the agency, was one of his most serious and devoted appointees. He previously served as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Environmental Division during the Bush administration. After that, he spent most of his career as a partner at Kirkland and Ellis and sued everyone and their mother, it seems like. And he also served as an adjunct law professor at the George Mason, now Scalia Law School, teaching two classes, law science, technology, and environmental law. He was elected to the American Law Institute in 2020. He served as a member of the American Bar Association's Governing Council, the Administrative Law Section, and spent more than a decade as the chair of the Federalist Society's Environmental and Property Rights Practice Group. He graduated from Harvard University in 1989 with an AB in Economics and Russian History, from the University of Delaware in 1993 with an MA in Urban Affairs, and from Georgetown University Law Center in 1995 with a JD. He clerked for Judge Danny J. Boggs of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, and he is a very, very smart and very based man. He is in a lot of trouble right now with all sorts of weird regime apparatchiks who seem to be very annoyed that he provided just some basic lawyering advice to the President of the United States. And so you should go support him on Give, Send, Go if you can. But you should also listen all the way through this very deep, intensive episode. Nick, what did you make of all that?
I know you said you monopolized the time, but I was really glad that you were talking for most of it, because I was just sitting here the whole time thinking, I'm so stupid. like I understood what was going on, but I'm like, I cannot think of an intelligent you covered it all. I no further questions, Your Honor. I end up, my father-in-law being a now retired lawyer, I end up hearing legal stories and harkening back to cases from like the 80s or whatever all the time. I always find them very interesting, but I have very little to say because I'm not a lawyer, was never interested in
Hank is going to get a kick out of this episode.
He's going to love this episode.
I cannot wait to hear his take on it. Hank and Jeff would be fascinating to make that meeting happen.
Yeah. He I always joke with Hank about how we'll get him, to be like the legal counsel for one of those, advisory boards to the president or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm sure he'll be less enthused about this part where I'm talking about him to all of our listeners, but he'll love the episode.
It's fine.
So,
and we hope that you guys will love it as well. We'll go now to Jeff Clark, a patriot and a scholar. Jeff, thank you for coming on the podcast.
I'm glad to be here, Saurabh. Thanks for inviting me.
We always like to hear about how people got to the point where they are today. You seem like such a nice, polite man. How did you end up being a regime enemy? How exactly did you trace that path?
Well, I wasn't, and I'll tell you a story about that, I guess, and kind of close to the midpoint. So, I went to Catholic high school and 12 years of Catholic school in Philadelphia, PA. I grew up what I thought was middle class, but I think was really lower middle class, as I found out later. My dad was a truck driver who never graduated from high school. He was diagnosed with cancer right as I was, getting close to college, but he managed to fight it and managed to see me graduate from Harvard with a degree in economics. And I studied Russian and Soviet history. I was a double major. And then I went to work for 3 years for the state of Delaware doing tax policy analysis. So I was kind of like a quasi-economist. And at nighttime, I picked up a degree at the School of Public Policy at the University of Delaware, which is now called the Biden School of Public Policy. And
did they send you an updated diploma?
They have not. So mine doesn't carry the Biden thing, but the various things on the web can kind of trigger it.
Yeah.
And then I also taught for the last year or maybe 3 semesters at the local Delaware Community College, which I believe Jill Biden taught at. So,
oh dear.
And then I went off to, I was debating different careers. I thought about, should I be an economist? Should I be a historian? Should I go to law school? Should I go to business school? Should I become a Sovietologist? And I decided, especially because the Soviet Union fell during that 3-year period, that Sovietology was probably not the right career path.
Yeah.
So I applied and got into the joint JD MBA program at Georgetown, which I started in 1992. But I love law school so much that I told the business school, which is who you report to for your second year in that 4-year program, I think I'm just going to go straight through law school, which I did. And then I went from law school on to a clerk for Judge Boggs, who eventually became the chief judge of the Sixth Circuit. He was considered for the Supreme Court for a time, I think for maybe the first Hispanic seat because his mother was Cuban. You know how that process goes. Lots of people are looked at, but only a few get the nod for what became Justice Kennedy's seat. And then, I had a blast doing that. And I had done a summer splitting between Kirkland & Ellis and between a firm that's now defunct. There was a big New Deal firm called Shea and Gardner and has produced a lot of law professors because I'm, kind of wonky, Saurabh, to be frank. And so, I went to work at Kirkland and I worked there from 96 until 2001 till August 2001. And then I joined the Justice Department. I got an appointment as a very young Deputy Assistant Attorney General. And so I did all of the appellate cases that went through the Environment Division in that period. Then I went back to Kirkland as a partner. And I was there from 2000. So I was in the administration, Bush 43, from 2001 to 2005. Then from 2005 to till my nomination to become the Assistant Attorney General of that same division, the Environment and Natural Resources Division of DOJ. I was nominated by President Trump in 2017 and had my confirmation hearing. But, for some reason, the Democrats wanted to fight my nomination, Saurabh. And so I was held up for, something like a record, like 14 months. So
Wow.
I was not confirmed until mid-October, right after Justice Kavanaugh was confirmed. And then I didn't take office until November 1st of 2018.
Wow.
And then I served from then until January 14th, 2021. That was my resignation date. And I was the only Assistant Attorney General to run 2 divisions because at the start of September, I was tapped by former Attorney General Barr, who issued a glowing press release at the time to run the Civil Division. So the Environment Division is 400 lawyers. The Civil Division is 1,000. So by the time I left the Justice Department, I had 1,400 lawyers under my supervision.
Wow. There's an element of that chronology that I find really interesting. I want to hear about what was your perception of the Bush DOJ? Because there is this interesting conceit out there that, you know, the Bush lawyers, they're really competent. They were on the ball, and the Trump lawyers were all these bumbling fools or whatever. Do you think that that's an apt comparison? I mean, the team behind Bush v. Gore does seem like it was very hyper competent and such. But what's your theory of that whole conceit?
Well, I think you're talking about two different things. So let me break them apart. One is, the lawyers who were inside the administration, right? And there might have been some overlap. I worked on Bush v. Gore, for instance, behind the scenes in terms of cases in the Florida Supreme Court. Then the ones who were, private lawyers, right? And so I would say that there's a lot of overlap in the kinds of people who got into the Justice Department. So some sort of argument that there was an entire cut of cloth or something of person who was in the Trump Justice Department versus the Bush Justice Department, I think is a misimpression. And I'll encapsulate this, for you with one story. I was talking to a former Solicitor General right before I started on November 1st in 2018. And I even talked to them in connection with my nomination. And that person said, surely everyone will be very happy with your return. You are a Bush retread. They could do a lot worse.
Yeah.
And so, that I'd give you in response to your question about how does a nice guy like me suddenly become, some sort of demonic target, who's been, painted and frozen in Alinskyite terms. And the answer is that's what the left does when you do something that they don't like.
Yeah. Did you find that people thought that you were going to be a relatively anodyne appointee because you had Bush experience? Do you feel like your class of people who had served in the Bush administration were seeking appointments in the Trump administration had it a little bit easier?
So, I'll put that question in terms of my confirmation hearing at the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Yeah, having the record-breaking longest time is probably
so I was on a panel with two officials for the Justice Department, myself and one of my former partners at Kirkland, Beth Williams, and then two folks who became judges on the federal district court here in D.C., Trevor Potter and Tim Kelly. And so, the questions were very anodyne, especially for the judges. Literally, they got some questions like, is it important for judges to be even-handed and open-minded? And those softballs that, yes, Senator, very much, right? And I think Beth got some questions that were like, not super penetrating, but a little bit more about some of the policy debates because she was going to head the Office of Legal Policy. But for me, Saurabh, I got an entirely different treatment, and probably 75 to 80% of the questions from the Democrats on the committee were trying to, throw me off my game, attack me. I got incredibly detailed questions. Like in 2007, you worked on a case in the DC Circuit where you wrote the following about the challenge to the ozone and particulate matter national ambient air quality standards. And on page 53, you said this: how can that possibly be defended? And I got, questions like that, especially from Senator Al Franken, who I grew up watching on Saturday Night Live, right? Yeah. So it was kind of a surreal experience to be questioned by him, like, do you understand what the ozone and particulate matter NACs are, Senator Franken? So anyway, I think that I pushed back all of that successfully. I think that he thought he had some gotcha questions, but it didn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, I'm from Minnesota, and Franken doesn't know what any of those words mean. He doesn't. But
he knows how to be grabby on planes, apparently.
Yeah, apparently. Yeah. I do want to ask, though, what was it about you that they hated so much, like right off the bat? Like why? For our listeners, I guess, and our watchers, why do they hate you? Pre now. Yeah. So I think the answer to that is that they do their due diligence, and so. They watched what I was doing at the Federalist Society, what I had written, speeches that I had given, panels that I'd been on. And also they talked to, I think, the career people at the Justice Department who I served with from 2001 to 2005. And it wouldn't have been hard for them to get stories like, Jeff argued for X and,
that wound up not being the position that was adopted, but boy, did he put up a spirited fight. And so if he comes in, the world could change on various things. One of those, for instance, that I was trying to change were the whole phenomena of citizen suits, which is used to basically block all kinds of projects and economic growth in America. And, in Bush 43, I had a project going about whether that violates the separation of powers, because it's essentially outsourcing law enforcement powers from the executive branch and the Justice Department to private entities that bring groups. And so, like when I raised that issue, that created a firestorm. There was a law professor, Richard Lazarus, whose brother actually works at the Environment Division in the appellate section as a manager. And it was like, Clark is talking about the unthinkable, to the environmental groups, to the green movement, sort of saying that this can't be done. So I think it's reasons like that. I think that's the answer to your question.
Do you want to get more involved with American Moment? Do you want to get off the couch and stop just watching a podcast about the issues you care about? Then you need to go to americanmoment.org/join. If you fill that form out, one of our team members will meet with you and we'll discuss how best to get you involved in politics and public policy here in DC. Maybe that involves you coming and working at a think tank or a congressional office. Maybe you're in business and it means just holding on for a few years until we get the next presidential administration. Maybe you're a very wealthy person who wants to give us a bunch of money. Either way, go to americanmoment.org/join to meet with a member of our team and get involved more substantively in trying to save this country. It's not enough to listen to podcasts. You actually have to do something. Did you ever get any visibility into what is probably like a very sophisticated, well-funded process to oppose nominations like yours? I'm assuming that, Sierra Club, NRDC, that they probably saw some combination of the work you did in Bush administration plus the kinds of cases that you were responsible for at Kirkland, and they said this is going to be a really effective person to oppose our agenda, and that's why all hell broke loose. Did you ever get any insight onto what that looked like behind the scenes, how they organized?
So yes, I saw obviously the letters that were sent in and the statements of opposition from those same kinds of, usual suspects that you might expect. But I had an effective campaign on the other side. At the Chamber of Commerce led, a call for me to be confirmed, and that actually, the fact that I was not being confirmed was causing damage because there were key rulemakings that were underway that I should be there to help defend. That a lot of business groups joined. The Farm Bureau joined, for instance. So, that I think was kind of like an evenly matched fight. But there was a problem about marijuana policy. I don't know if you remember this, but basically, Senator, then Attorney General Sessions, he announced that he was reversing a policy about not enforcing the marijuana laws in states that had purported to legalize it. Yeah, and that created a firestorm. One of the senators basically put a hold on all Justice Department nominees during the period, that was happening. So that's kind of like a self-inflicted wound on the Republican side.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Huh. What was it like once you actually landed at Department of Justice? It was 2018. So presumably some of the really, really bad Obama holdovers were basically gone. What was paint a picture for us of what the landscape was like once you arrived in your office.
So, Saurabh, this is something I want to do some theoretical work on, but there's a concept in the Justice Department that's been called the duty to defend. So it may surprise you, you're thinking in terms of personnel. But in terms of policy, there's just always a significant amount of policy because of how long litigation takes, where you're actually, in some instances, defending the policies of the prior administration, right? And you want to change that ship, right? But oftentimes, the Justice Department is not the principal entity in charge of righting the ship. It's that policy decision is lodged in some other agency. So maybe EPA in my instance, or the Department of Interior, or the Department of Energy. And so, sometimes the Solicitor General's office, which only has two political appointees, the Solicitor General and then the Principal Deputy Solicitor General, but they have a lot of career folks. Sometimes they will basically require that there be formal statements or formal rulemakings done, which which take time, until they're going to allow the Justice Department to actually start repping the new policy rather than the old policy. So I did arrive and have to do some of that, kind of defending the prior policy. But, anyone who's a legal advocate and has worked at a law firm, I think increasingly maybe young people don't understand this. This is one reason why it looks like there are a number of federal judges who are actually saying they're not going to hire law clerks from Yale anymore. They get into law firms and they rebel and they refuse to work on the particular kinds of cases. But certainly the way I was raised, and I think people, maybe one half generation below me for sure, and certainly older generations, is you're an advocate, right? You take the positions that your clients take. You're an agent of a principal. Oftentimes, you're not the principal.
Was there, if the locus of responsibility wasn't necessarily on your division at DOJ, it was upstream, it was EPA policymaking. Did you have any particular insight or maybe frustration at the slowness with which reformers at EPA were operating, or any insight into maybe missed opportunities because of pacing on that front?
Well, I think that the colleagues in general that I had in the Trump administration at other agencies were very good, and they were trying to move things along as rapidly as is prudent. But you don't want to rush things too fast, because basically if you miss something in, say, a rulemaking process, then that can be jammed down your throat in litigation, and then you lose, and then you have to go back potentially to square one. So there's an incentive to spend the optimal amount, like the golden mean amount of time on something, not too long, not too short. But oftentimes there are, what people have called deep state forces. I really try to reserve deep state for intelligence community things and meta systems. But administrative state, let's call it that, administrative state, career bureaucrat resistance, and that can add extra time, and those obstacles need to be fought through, and they require someone who has energy, someone who understands what the levers are, and I think one thing that happened in the Trump administration is that there's a learning curve. And so if new people come in, they don't really get their feet under them until, late 2018, or if you're held up I didn't need that because I'd already been at the division. So I knew how everything worked, but other people are just totally new to it and they got to learn. And then, by the time they're really up and running, the first term's almost over.
Yeah. Say more about what the components of that expertise and experience might be. Like, what is the minimum viable product of knowledge that a successful appointee at somewhere like DOJ in a division like yours would need in order to be successful, effective, and appropriately fast as soon as possible?
Sure. Well, I think I'd start with, what we used to call at our law firm candle power. So, some people have a lot of candle power and other people have, lower candle or horsepower.
No morons is what you're saying.
Right. And then, there's a training component, right? If you spent a good chunk of time at a large law firm doing significant work, then, you get a level of training that you just don't otherwise get. Also at the law firm I went to, Kirkland & Ellis, it really was like dog years. So the time I spent, for instance, being, one of the main lawyers on all the appellate fights about Deepwater Horizon for BP. I billed like more than 3,000 hours many of those years. That's like the equivalent of like 2 jobs, right? So each year that goes by, your experience is stacking up more than other people. I think that it's for going to the Justice Department, it's litigation experience, it's candle power, and then it's judgment, which is also something that that I guess you can acquire, but it can be hard if you don't have some kind of native sense of it. Like what will fly with courts, right? What kinds of positions can be adopted? What are your odds of winning so that you can successfully advise, sometimes when the principal is in another agency, how they should frame their rule and what kinds of things they shouldn't do versus should do.
How would you compare and contrast the median ability along all those different metrics of your typical Dem appointee in a Democratic administration versus your typical Republican one?
So I think that in some areas it's very similar, right? Like they're just kind of, on one side versus the other. But in several of the divisions, right? There are 7 litigating divisions at the Justice Department. Let me see if I can tick them off quickly. There's civil, there's criminal, there's antitrust, there's tax, there's civil rights, there's the environment division, and there's the national security division. And so I think in terms of the environment division and in terms of the civil rights division, maybe even more so, there are a lot of folks who come in.
The hyper-ideological division.
Call them the hyper-ideological divisions. There is a tendency sometimes to bring in folks to run that who are not kind of lawyers, if you know what I mean. They might be coming from environmental groups or think tanks. And sometimes they're not the people who are even running the litigation, right? They're just sort of like the managers or face people or something like that.
Ideological commissars, something like that.
You're very good at coming up with quick terminology, Saurabh. I applaud you there. So yes, but like if you're talking about who tends to run the tax division, it's like, okay, you get a conservative tax lawyer or you get a liberal tax lawyer, right? But the credential level, I don't really think tends to be all that different.
But both are partners at one of the biggest law firms of the world, probably.
Yes.
The people running it. Got it.
And what are these like staff attorney? I mean, there are thousands of them within the department. What are they like? What are their backgrounds? How do they kind of influence the way that we enforce our law?
Okay. So yeah, that's a good question. Let me tell you about this, which you probably haven't focused on, right? There are kind of two paths to get into the Justice Department. One is that you start your legal career off there in something called the honors program. And so, you're in law school, you apply for the honors program, and a small number of people get into the honors program, and they start as brand new lawyers at the Justice Department, right? And some of the department's kind of very notable and very successful lawyers come from that because they really get sort of like early steepage in how the Justice Department works, right? And
is it considered very prestigious to get that program?
It is considered prestigious to get into the honors program, hence the name. Mm-hmm. And then the other way to come in is laterally, right? You go off and do something else. You might work at a law firm, you might work at some group, you might work on the Hill, and then you apply and then you begin your later years of your career as a lateral lawyer. So I would say that look, in terms of the civil division, the tax division, the antitrust division, right? Like these things, maybe a little bit the antitrust division, they're not seen as having like an external ideological, kind of goal in mind, right? But in the environment division and the civil rights division, the people view themselves as having a certain mission. So one of the things I encountered, and one of the things I, didn't follow in terms of how the environment division would run, is that people should get credit for their level of devotion to the mission. Mm-hmm. Because I think that's just sort of a disguised ideological screening mechanism, right? Mm-hmm. I think what you're really looking for is someone who has excellent neutral legal skills and can learn to be a good advocate for the positions that they're assigned to take. Mm-hmm. And they're not the ones choosing what the positions are, or they shouldn't be. They should be taking that either from above in terms of cases where the plaintiff or the defendant is the United States, in which case there is no agency, or in cases where the plaintiff or defendant is a particular agency, from that agency. So I think this whole concept of mission, that is something that's foreign or should be foreign to how the department operates.
What are the ways that an ideologically motivated lawyer in those especially ideological departments does end up affecting the process in a way that's probably immoral or inappropriate?
One way is that they can, if they're dealing with someone who doesn't have greater familiarity with a lot of these issues than they do, is that they can artificially constrain the available options, mm-hmm. right? So, the decision maker who's there only for a short time, right? And we're talking about people who may spend 20 years, 30 years, 40 years of their career at the Justice Department. They say that, well, you can only do A or B. But A or B's like Overton window is like very myopic.
Yeah.
And so, there's a category of legal acumen I refer to as legal creativity, right? Yeah. Some people have that, some people don't. But in any event, sometimes they recognize that there are creative things that conservatives might be able to do, but if they're dealing with someone who doesn't have the broader view, then they don't get presented with the options. And so they think their options are very narrow. I think, for instance, that's probably one reason why former Attorney General Sessions recused himself. I think he was given, a sort of narrow analysis of how to look at that problem. And, you got to like penetrate in, and you have to, this is also where the candle power comes in. I'll give you one example. This is like something that's like it's a very good example because it doesn't involve any big policy fight, right? The issue is, how could I use my LinkedIn account when I was at the Justice Department? Okay, so the advice I get is you can't use your LinkedIn account. And so, some people would stop there. They'd be like, okay, I guess I just deactivate my LinkedIn account. My question is why? Why can't I use my LinkedIn account? And the answer is, social media can be problematic. Okay, why is it problematic? And then it's, well, we think it's analogous to nepotism.
What?
And I said, yeah. So that was my reaction, right? And I said, how could it possibly be analogous to nepotism? And the answer was, because it's inherently narrow casting to your network, to people who know about you, much like you'd be talking with your family members. And I said, okay, excuse me. Like I actually, can I physically do this? Give me a break.
Yeah.
Like, that is just a ridiculous rationale. So I just conclude that you have no basis for saying that I can't use my LinkedIn account.
Yeah.
And then, there was no pushback on that because logically the position had collapsed.
Yeah.
So there have to be appointees who get in, who can make baffle-gab, purported legal decisions that are essentially just obstructionism collapse.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, I've heard this analogy in the intelligence community or a national security apparatus before, is like, well, how did the neocons win in DC? Is that, they'll present three options to a president. One is like demented hawkishness. One is like insane hawkishness. And one is like pure peacenik, lie on the ground, get bombed by nuclear weapons. And it's like, oh, well, the middle option is to do that. And so the framing of the Overton window from the career officials is I think, hugely operative in so many different domains. What was unique about the Trump administration DOJ in your view? Was there anything particular that was strange based on experience that you had in the previous administration, but also presumably talking to people who had served in multiple administrations?
Right. So I spent 4 years in the Bush administration and over 2 years in the Trump administration. Call it like 2.25. So I would say that the comparison is it was better in the Trump administration because I would sit in so many meetings where I would say, we should do this. This is, this is better policy. This is more consistent with the law. This is more consistent with what the folks who actually, because we're in a democratically elected branch, or it goes through a constitutional process, the Electoral College, for electing the president, right? So it's all what I'm suggesting is more consistent with that than what you're suggesting. And so many times it would, in the Bush administration, it was like, yeah, but we're really going to get beat up in the Washington Post and the New York Times about that. To which, my response is like, good, or like, so who cares, or poppycock, right? That's certainly a reason not to do something that is dictated or at least strongly suggested by what proper constitutional law is. I remember I was having a discussion with one appointee about Clean Water Act issues that involved constitutional limits on the Commerce Clause power. And I was raising these constitutional limits under the Commerce Clause power. And, he had a cow and he exploded and he said, like, that's tendentious. I don't want to talk about the Constitution. And so I will assure you that when I would have meetings with political appointees in the Trump administration, not once did I ever hear anything remotely like that, Saurabh. Mm-hmm. So it was very different. There was much more of a willingness to entertain new ideas, to not think that there were sacred cows, to follow the Constitution, and to do the kinds of things that that President Trump wanted to see done.
Did any of your assessment of credentialing change over the course of the last 20 years, having seen both these administrations? I mean, whether it's about Ivy League, clerkships, being at fancy law firms, has your assessment of the relative merits or demerits of all those credentials evolved in any meaningful way?
I think that I don't think there's a systematic way in which it's evolved, But what I think is true is that it's idiosyncratic. You have to take each person on their own merits. And so, if there are some people who have a litmus test of you must have gone to a particular law school in order to be even remotely in the ballpark, I don't agree with that. I mean, I've seen people come into Kirkland and Ellis, for instance, who were Supreme Court law clerks and bomb out because they weren't particularly good. In fact, I had a mentor who referred to one person in that category who was like a rough contemporary with me as Dr. Swango. I don't know if that's a reference. He was a doctor who was killing his patients.
Oh my goodness.
So the point was like, you would not want this person to be your lawyer, right? Yeah. By the same token, I've encountered, it tends to be folks like at the top of their class at other law schools, or even just people who, like maybe they were in, like top half or top third of their law school, and it wasn't like, it's not a super distinguished law school, but they worked really, really hard, right? Like there is a way to overcome credentialization. But when people ask me about going to law school, for instance, I do tell them that I think that I've had a very fortunate legal career by and large. Obviously, I'm under assault at the moment, but I've had a very fortunate legal career. I've never had to do what I regarded as kind of like grunge work. I was always doing kind of like high theory and things like that. And that the legal field is very heavily stratified. So, you want to get into the best possible law school, then you want to do as best as possible. And then you want to get on the law review and the best possible law review among the range of options. And then you want to get the best clerkship, you preferably federal. And then, if you get a Supreme Court clerkship, you're in in an entirely different class. It's just, there are all these stratification things. At the end of the day, they're helpful. They give you a leg up, like the more you can do that, but they're not entirely dispositive. And, there are some people who, you also have to talk about debt loads and things like that. So anyway, what I would say I've learned is that, don't be a snob. Don't, just assume that people like have particular credentials, ergo they're great, or other people don't have them, ergo they're bad. I think that thinking is very wrong.
Do you feel like the nature of your job and the job of the DOJ, a conservative in a Republican DOJ, changed from administration to administration because of the evolving nature of the federal judiciary? And you can take that any which way, the institutionalization of maybe, originalism via the Federalist Society, and those being a lot of the Trump appointees, or maybe 8 years of Obama getting a lot of appointees through. What do you feel like that the nature of the judiciary changed the nature of your work?
Well, as someone who had done a lot of work in the DC circuit, the number of appointees that the Obama administration got on that court changed its complexion significantly. Certainly when I was a younger lawyer, like when starting in 96, right, through the Obama administration, there was kind of like a DC circuit of one type. And I also understood it historically because I would read a lot of cases from the Reagan era, mm-hmm. right, that what did the judiciary look like then? But then, like now I'm a partner at a law firm and I've been at the Justice Department and I'm watching as the Obama administration appoints different judges and other judges, retire, that you see that change and you watch it, unfold. Now it's sort of largely in place, right? So I would say, I've really kind of seen three eras by studying it, the Reagan era, and then to some extent the Carter era. I grew up in a DC circuit of a particular range up until 2009, and then now I see the current DC circuit. So yeah, I mean the evolution of who the personnel is on the courts as judges certainly has an impact in how you practice, and therefore it has an impact in how you advise your clients, right? If you're going to challenge something, if you're on the receiving end of a government action, that's what a lawyer is paid to do, is to exercise that kind of form of judgment.
Going back to your time in the Trump administration, what was it like to be the principal of the two most ideological and then some of the very large divisions at DOJ? I mean, is there any historical precedent for that? And also, I mean, what was your day like when you were in charge of both?
I don't think there have been many situations where the same person, had a significant span of time to run two divisions. And I should also say, I don't want to claim too much credit in that I had a very able principal deputy in the Environment Division. And so I kept my hand in that, right? But I turned my focus to the new division that's 2.5 times larger than the existing division.
Mm-hmm.
And I would kind of keep my hand in things that I thought were very important to kind of see through to the end. But the other thing I'd say is that the civil rights division, right? That's the one I think is ideological, is not the same as the civil division. So I had the civil division, not the civil rights division.
Sorry, my apologies.
Yeah. So in the civil division, the kinds of issues you have all the immigration issues. So there are a lot of hot button issues.
So plenty of opportunities for very ideological stuff there too.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Very interesting.
So yeah, no, I mean, it's a very, unique, and I feel, blessed and favored to have, to gotten the opportunity to run too.
What was the general tenor of the last year of because when did you take over the second one? Was that in the last year?
September of 2020.
September 2020.
A couple months before the election.
So, what was the environment like at DOJ during an election year? What were some of the, and this will obviously go into some of the things you've gotten in trouble for, but what was the mood like? Did it feel different or similar to what it was like when you were in the Bush administration?
So, first of all, the Justice Department is, like you're bound by the Hatch Act, right? You're not going out and you're not doing politicking.
Sure.
Right. So I wasn't doing that in the 2004 election, right? I wasn't doing that in the 2020 election. I think that there was kind of a cautious optimism in Bush 43 that he would get a second term. I think the mood on the Trump administration is that there was hope, but there was probably a bit less optimism. That it felt like, particularly with the COVID crisis and how the lockdowns of sort of affected the economy, because at the end of the day, a lot of people in America vote their pocketbook, right? That there might be cause for less optimism if I compared 2020 cycle to 2004 cycle.
Mm-hmm. And so election season comes around, and there were obviously a lot of questions about what exactly went on, and you found yourself smack dab at the middle of it. Tell us that story. What is it that you started working on in the last few months of the administration that got everyone so very angry at you?
Well, there are some things behind the scenes that I worked on that have not been a focus, because the focus has been on a particular issue of whether I wrote a draft letter that was debated internally at the Justice Department to send to the state of Georgia. But, there are some other things I worked on that were within the span of the civil division's power. So, in terms of that whole issue about the letter, right? The important thing to understand about that.
And what was this letter, just for the basics of?
So the letter, which has been released publicly, but I won't, sort of testify about the letter,
Sure.
given various privilege positions that I would take, and then I want to return to the privilege point.
Mm-hmm.
The letter that's been publicly released, the draft letter, is a letter to the state of Georgia's two houses of the legislature and to Governor Kemp, indicating that there's a direct constitutional delegation to state legislatures to decide who the electors are from that state. And the Supreme Court indeed has said that there's plenary power over that question. Mm-hmm. Indeed, there's a case about the independent state legislature doctrine before the Supreme Court this term, the Moore case. And so the letter says that the Georgia legislators could call themselves, two houses could call themselves in a special session to investigate further information that had come out from a particular Senate committee that a state senator in Georgia, Ligon, had run. And that's really it. And so, at some level, I'll just take a step back and say, there's a firestorm about that. But it shows that, the Democrats can make mountains out of molehills. But to return to the privilege points, which are significant. Okay, if there's something that's debated inside the legislative branch, and indeed is debated before the president, who becomes the ultimate decision maker, all of that should be entirely confidential. It should be sacred. It should be sacrosanct. It should be respected. And lawyers take an oath of confidentiality. And so, it was in late January of 2021, after President Biden took office, that anonymous leakers went and they started talking about these deliberations and about, this letter that created the firestorm.
Were these careers that had been that had continued from administration to administration, or did they have visibility into records from the previous administration that they discovered this in?
Well, I mean, part of the problem of having anonymous leakers is you don't know who they are,
right.
Saurabh. But I think, all indications from the story would be that at least some of the people who were in meetings with the president were the ones doing the leaking. And the main meeting that they focused on, a January 3rd meeting, is a meeting that was, other than President Trump, attended exclusively by lawyers. So anyone who went to the press to talk about the contents of that meeting is not following what the proper legal strictures are. So that's, it's not something I want to cover in any depth, but I'll make one quick reference to it, right? The DC bar is, looking at charges that were filed by its prosecutor against me at the moment, but it appears as if there have been no investigations of those violations of legal ethics by those who were the anonymous leakers. It's a strange double standard, Saurabh.
What has it been like to have the full force of, it seems like, a constellation of lefty NGOs and federal prosecutors and the entire regime apparatus to come down to bear on you? What just has that experience been like personally?
Well, it's not the greatest. It's certainly not what I anticipated doing, at the end after I left the Trump administration. But, that's not what God apparently had in store. And, I'm not crying over spilt milk. I'm currently at the Center for Renewing America. I'm very grateful for my work there to try to help change various legal paradigms and policy paradigms, along with Russ Vought, our fearless leader, the former OMB head who I worked closely with, particularly because the largest and most significant for the national economy rulemakings are the ones that come out of EPA. So we had an obvious overlap. So yes, I mean, it's not been great to have all those things attack, but it's become trite at this point, right? But if you're over the target and you're being effective, you're going to be attacked. And the left has this narrative that the 2020 election is just unquestionable. Somehow, the 2016 election was questionable. The 2004 election was questionable. The 2000 election that, resulted in Bush v. Gore, that was all questioned. People like Jamie Raskin can stand up on the floor and object to electors for Republican presidents they don't like. But if Republicans do it, it's a coup. It's an insurrection. It's another double standard.
Yeah, it's been really amazing to watch. I mean, the Democrats' view at this point is essentially that any election that they don't win is per se illegitimate, which I think is just one of the most absurd status quos to set up in American life. What has the contours of your post administration work look like? What are some of those particular avenues of reform that you think are really obvious and need to be tackled immediately?
So one project that Russ Vought had and Ken Cuccinelli, who served as the number 2 in the Department of Homeland Security and is also a senior fellow at the Center for Renewing America, just before not just before, but they had it in play, and there were still steps to be taken, hopefully to turning the dial on this, is the whole issue of an invasion on the southern border. And the fact that the Constitution grants the states the independent power to repel actual invasions. And that's a power that the AG of Arizona agreed with us is one that, the states can exercise. He has an excellent opinion on that topic. Gubernatorial candidate Carrie Lake in Arizona has pledged that she will follow through in actually making that the policy of Arizona, beginning as early as day 1 of her administration.
What would that let them do if they declared an invasion?
I think they could basically do what they were doing with the program that related to COVID, which is they could meet folks coming across at the border and they could reflect them back and send them back across the border. We're not talking about
using their state guards or what
could use
law
that
power?
could use state rangers maybe, or state troopers, depending on what kind of state and what they call themselves, to do that. So we're not talking about the state of Arizona buying tanks and B-1 bombers and attacking Mexico. But obviously people would need to resist the cartels, and the cartels are dangerous, and they're armed, and they're armed with, sophisticated weaponry and other technologies. So, you would need the ability to resist that. But, the main thing I think is you would just say that, they're the folks who are coming across, if they're entering illegally, that they should be repulsed. So I've been working on that issue since I joined. And in particular, I worked on a memo I did jointly with Ken Cuccinelli about, I think, an excuse not to do that, which is that if that policy were pursued, somehow the Justice Department is going to start filing criminal civil rights charges. So this would be in the Civil Rights Division, out of the Civil Rights Division, to bring the agents, the troopers, the state guardsmen up on criminal charges for discriminating against immigrants. And so the paper explains why that is, or should be a phantom fear, because it's something at the very least. I'll just give you one of the many reasons in the paper, but because, it would be subject to qualified immunity.
Interesting. This is a slightly orthogonal question. One of the things that's concerned me a lot is that, obviously a huge priority of conservative jurisprudence for the last 20, 30 years has been reducing the size and scope of the administrative state and recognizing how these things work. My concern is that the first domino to fall on the effectiveness of the administrative state will be some unholy coalition of like libertarian originalists and the left deciding that, yes, the administrative state is illegitimate, but only when it comes to enforcing immigration law. Do you have any concern about this at the federal level, that we are jurisprudentialing our way out of the ability to enforce immigration law at all?
Well, I think that
Sessions versus DiMaia and cases like this were obviously front of mind.
I think that there's a historic power of the Attorney General, really, and he's still involved in these, issues, despite sort of the rise of, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and now, DHS, right, to make policy in this area. And, Congress can obviously set naturalization laws. But, everything is always kind of a two-edged sword, right? You can see that, there's some policies that the right likes, that are supported by the administrative state and by current administrative law doctrines. We could talk about the meta doctrine of Chevron and where that stands, which Justice Scalia was one of the real champions of. But word was that shortly before his death, he was reconsidering that and thinking that basically it was allowing the administrative state to run amok. And so, times can change. So I think we need reform in that area. Inherently, you don't see only sacred cows of your political opponents slain. You can sometimes, see some things, dominoes fall, that you might not rather see if you could be the czar. But in America, no one should want to be the czar. We should want to have our Montesquieu-inspired separation of powers, where there's a Congress, there's a president, and there's a court, and they're all jostling with each other, and they all have their own separate role. And the outcome of that actually should be to preserve liberty, and should be that it's difficult to pass laws. And so I think part of reforming the administrative state is to return it to that vision, where it's more difficult to actually get new laws in place. At the moment, right, the volume of what's in the Code of Federal Regulations and what comes out of the Federal Register is just mind-numbing. There's no way anyone could understand all of it.
But is there any part of you that has maybe started to reevaluate what exactly the balance of power in American life is? And here, I won't put words in your mouth, I'll just lay it out. It seems like the strictures by which conservatives restrain themselves under Republican administrations are extremely tight, and it's very, very hard to get positive reform done. And the left seems completely unrestrained. under left-wing administrations.
Right.
And that's frustrating. What do you say to people who say that that's a rotten deal and we should avail ourselves of more opportunities and tools?
Yeah. I think that just yesterday I was hearing someone describe this very issue that you're describing with this colorful analogy, which is, that the conservatives are playing with 18th century British rules of warfare. Mm-hmm. And, the other side is fighting, asymmetrical warfare, guerrilla warfare, war by all means. Yeah. And so I do think we need to sometimes take the gloves off. Mm-hmm. I think it becomes a question sometimes of what the roles are in taking that off. And so there's certainly like lots of progress that can be made even at a more genteel level, right? So we saw, I think, a very important case come out of the Supreme Court at the end of the last term, the West Virginia versus EPA case, which enshrined in these terms the major questions doctrine for the first time. And the argument is, the doctrine is essentially that, look, if you have a major question of economic and political significance, that you shouldn't lightly assume that a statute, especially if the statute sat there for a long time and nobody ever saw this in the statute before. It's also related to this principle that's grown up in the last 3 decades or so of Congress doesn't hide elephants in mouse holes. So when you're discovering elephants in mouse holes, the major questions doctrine should be the antidote to that, and to say you need to have a clear statement by Congress that they actually wanted to give earth-shattering power over, these great questions of economic and political significance to an administrative agency. Otherwise, it's a question that the agency should return to Congress to ask, like, wow, in light of new circumstances, Congress, we'd really like to have this new power. Can you give it to us? And then it's up for debate in our Republican system, and it is adopted or it's not. That's the system, I think, that's a lot closer to the classic Constitution. And then I'd also commend to you, if you haven't read it, Justice Gorsuch's separate opinion in Virginia versus EPA, which puts even more meat on the bones of the major questions doctrine, and says that major issues of federalism, major issues of the separation of powers, these things should also be considered major questions and therefore require some clear statement by Congress before the balance of power can be upset.
When it comes to the unique solution that you guys at CRA have started advancing on the question of border enforcement invasion, that's a state level answer to what has historically been understood as a federal question. There's another case at an even lower level of Texas and their private right of action for abortion. What do you make of the proliferation of these alternative, clever lawyering tactics in order to pursue what we want? Do you think it's a sign that of opportunities that were just sitting by the wayside, or are these oddball implements that have to be brought to hand because we just don't seem to get what we want done at the federal level?
Well, I think there's part of it. I mean, I had mentioned this concept of legal creativity, mm-hmm. right? So, if extraordinary times call for extraordinary responsive legal creativity. Mm-hmm. And so you do want to look at like what weapons you actually can find at hand in the existing text of the Constitution, mm-hmm. and its doctrines. But I also think that it's in general just another part of the genius of the design of the constitutional system, right? Justice Kennedy, not a fan of all of his work, mm-hmm. right? But I think there's one particular
Sweet Mystery of Life.
Yes, exactly. But there is, especially on federalism questions, there is some genius, and at the very least in his writing, right? So he coined this phrase that when the framers created federalism, they split the atom of sovereignty, mm-hmm. right, and released a lot of power to actually conduce to liberty. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. And so I think what you're seeing with a lot of these responses at the state level, Saurabh, is you're seeing that, if the federal government becomes too overweening, then the states, they're inherently becoming sort of like a constitutional antigen to, a virus of having too much federal control, too much centralization. And I think the framers foresaw that. And that's why they didn't just provide that the federal government is supreme in all areas, right? Instead, we have in Article 1 a Congress with enumerated powers and only enumerated powers. And then we have, the 9th and 10th Amendments, right? And we have the structural system of federalism. So the words federalism and the words separation of powers, they don't appear in the Constitution, but their structure is unmistakable. Mm-hmm. And certainly the framers talked about those doctrines frequently. So I think that here, a lot of what you're calling innovation and that's leading to this legal creativity is based on the genius of having a system that is a federalist in nature.
The institutional conservative legal movement, I think is fair to say, has not been a great friend to you in the last few months and this last year. Why do you think that is? Do you think that it has become corrupted like intellectual ideological movements sometimes do? What's your read on that?
Well, we're obviously facing, and this is one of the other big topics for the CRA, which is we're facing the issue of woke government, right, and also woke quasi-government in the form of all of the giant corporations and all of the giant entities that control access to capital, adopting these, environmental, social governance, ESG policies. So I think in part it's that, and in part it's just that,
as in those corporate entities still have a lot of sway over the institutional conservative movement, and that's why they weren't there to help you.
I think you can trace it through multiple steps, right? So if you're, first of all, let's just start with the law firms, right? If you're at a law firm, oftentimes, they marry different kinds of practices. Like there's a transactional practice, like, mergers and acquisitions, buying new companies, bankruptcy, restructurings, and then there's a litigation side. Okay. So, if all the BlackRocks of the world, right, and if all of the major corporations are woke, right, they're driving a lot of the policies that essentially the corporate lawyers are enshrining through what they're doing, right? So then now you're at the management level of the firm. And even if you have 50% of your lawyers who are conservatives on the litigation side, they're still diluted by the power and the money that's coming in from the transactional practice, right? So I think that's one thing that results in it. And so then if the law firm as a whole is kind of like weakening, and they're contributing to organizations, right, that could provide mediating institutions, right, that would be a bigger check to go tax on particular people, like someone like me, right, that can be diminished or that can be chilled. The other thing is just, Saurabh, straight up capture, right, that if you're a benefactor, a philanthropist who is, more of a neocon bent, right, you can help, blunt populism by donating to certain organizations and then, sort of pulling the reins back on what it is that they're going to do. And then the other thing we've been pursuing is fighting back against the weaponization of government. So the weaponization of government is creating a lot of fear, right? So there are some people who might be interested in fighting through all the other forces I just described, but they're afraid of what it might mean for them, right? Maybe then all that's going to happen is there's going to be a target trained on their back. I would urge anyone who watches this to realize that, look, you want to stand on your feet, even if that involves dying, because principles are important. You don't want to, get down on your knees and be subservient and then regret that choice for the rest of your life and have to explain it to your children.
I think the exact number escapes me, in less than 1,000 days, I think that's accurate, there will potentially be a conservative president elected. What's your advice to them?
I think that they should be, if they're thinking about running, they should be using this period to reflect on the kinds of pushback and obstacles and deep state and administrative state resistance that was shown to President Trump, and think about how they're going to fight back on that, right? Mm-hmm. That it's not going to be, you don't want to be in a mode where you're purely reactive. You want to arrive with a very good sense of who the personnel should be so that you can fill the 6,000 or so positions in the plum book, however, whatever the right number is, as many as possible on day one, with parachute teams, right? If you don't get, the ability to get everyone through, especially with the Senate confirmation process, obviously that takes longer time. But you need to be as close to ready with all of that at the start. And you have to be ready with what you're going to do in the first 100 days in concrete terms. And you even want to think about things like, rulemaking text in your head, text of executive orders, so that those things are ready to go. So I think it's good to be tan, rested, and ready, but you also want to be educated, prepped, deep thinking and ready.
One of the musical bits in the original Lion King movie is "Be prepared," and that sounds like your guidance, and I think it's certainly a good one. Jeff, how can people keep up with everything that you're doing, your work, your many travails at the hands of this regime, and all the ways you're causing them trouble?
So I think, you can see what I'm doing for the Center for Renewing America at our website, which is just a quick Google search for Center for Renewing America.
I believe it's renewingamerica.org.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then on social media, I'm Jeff Clark US on Twitter and the same on Getter. And then on Truth Social, I believe I am Real Jeff Clark. And if I could make one plug, Saurabh, here at the end, which is as these attacks heat up, I would appreciate, if anyone would go to Give, Send, Go and help me out with my legal defense. Mm-hmm. And Give, Send, Go is such a wonderful site, right? Even if your means would not allow you to do that at the moment, you can send me a prayer, which I highly highly would appreciate. And my Give, Send, Go is givesendgo.com/Jeff Clark.
I highly encourage people to check that out. Again, I've been I'll say something that maybe you can't say. I've been thoroughly disgusted by a lot of the institutional conservative movement and how little they've stepped up to defend the people who are some of our smartest, most capable, intelligent warriors who maybe just had a slightly different perspective on some of this election stuff than some of the more establishment types. And so I think that that's partially why I think so highly of Russ, is that he would hire you and step into that void. So thank you for everything that you do, and thank you for coming on Moment of Truth.
Well, thank you for having me, and I absolutely share your appreciation for Russ, both at a personal level and at a level of respecting what he's trying to do for the country.
We hope you enjoyed that episode, and we hope that you will rate and review this Moment of Truth podcast on all platforms, whether that's giving it a thumbs up on YouTube and subscribing, whether it's rating and reviewing the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, 5 stars only. It really does help us with the algorithm, especially because we're assuming that YouTube is going to zap this interview. So please check us out on Rumble as well. Alternative media platforms are more important than ever. But thank you guys, as always, for listening, and we hope you'll tune in next week for another episode of Moment of Truth. Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to AmericanMoment.org to learn more.